Hi, this is Jeffrey Capobianco from Breakthrough Performance Coaching. It is Wednesday, April 15th. This is our Zoom meeting. On the call tonight, we have Greg Hillson from INSCYD. Greg is going to give us a nice walkthrough of INSCYD's new Power Performance Decoder. All right, take it away, Greg.
In terms of questions, I would encourage as much question as possible, or as many questions as possible. Two ways to do this. One is in the chat box. Please go ahead and throw it in there. I'll do my best to be taking a look at that. And then two would be at the end. I'll try to make sure that I save some time for some Q&A. And then if there's anything that's highly urgent, somebody needs to interject with something, jump in. I'm a big fan of trying to keep this as interactive as possible. I know in a virtual environment with 20 plus people, I can become a little bit challenging, but let's try to keep this as conversational as possible. I don't want to sound like I'm monologuing too much here. So quickly about myself and INSCYD. So INSCYD's been around for the last 12, 15 years. It's been a tool used by primarily cycling and swim federations. The origins of the technology start with Team HTC High Road back in 2007, 2008. When they had a pretty strong team with Mark Cavendish, Tony Martin, among others. And this was Stapleton's secret weapon, and he didn't really want access for other teams. So it stayed there for a handful of years, or less than that even. And then eventually our first commercial client was the French Swimming Federation about 7 years ago, 6-7 years ago. Since then, INSCYD has become a software that is accessible for coaches like Jeff and Sue. And what it allows for is through either lactate testing or power testing, the coach is able to get a complete physiological or metabolic profile of an athlete. And we're going to talk about what that means here in a second. So that's a quick overview of where we are today. In terms of some of the teams and federations that use it, we have Matthew Vanderpoel and his team using it. We have Team Visma, so that's the team of Wout van Aert, among others, and a handful, if not more, other World Tour cycling teams. We also have a number of professional triathletes that are using it, including Jan Frodeno, Lionel Sanders, Cam Worth on the men's side. And then on the women's side, I think we had 6 or 7 of the top 10 at Kona last year. Not a big fan of talking about the professional athletes as much as more the age groupers, because I think what we're going to talk about today has more application and more utility for somebody that's a little bit more time crunched. And hopefully that becomes a little bit easier to understand as we go through the presentation today. So with that, I'm going to attempt to share my screen here and see if we are able to do this. Let me just pull up my presentation. All right, you guys see my presentation okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. So what I thought might be useful is to go through and talk about what are the main things that we're trying to capture as a coach, and for you as the athlete, why do you care? So the takeaway from this conversation should be, all right, what am I doing today in terms of my training, and what is there that's out there to help me improve as an athlete? And really the fundamental idea around INSCYD is the ability to capture a complete profile of an athlete. So if you think about going to a doctor, go to the doctor, typically they're going to want to have you do blood work on an annualized basis, maybe some other testing if they find something going on. INSCYD is looking inside you as an athlete, no pun intended, to capture your metabolic profile. Metabolic profile in our vernacular means VO2 max, so your aerobic capacity or size of the engine, your VLA max, which is your anaerobic capacity. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. Your threshold power, so what you can hold for an hour, and that's really defined as lactate production and combustion rates are in a steady state, homeostasis. Fat and carb combustion, so this is really important if we're talking about fueling strategy, what you're going to be doing for a 5, 6, 7, 10 plus hour race. How do you optimize that based on what your pace strategy is going to be? And then lactate production and combustion. And this is going to allow us as a coach to be able to prescribe a very specific type of workout depending upon what we're trying to advance. So if we're looking to get an adaptation to your VO2 max system or your aerobic capacity, give that a boost, we want to know how much lactate is being produced for each minute that we have you going out there and doing this 3, 4, 5 minute interval. And that's going to influence A, how much recovery time we give you, and B, how much total time we need to give you in that zone to be able to get max adaptation. So with that, we jump into the presentation here. Let me see if I can get the full screen to come up. All right, so let's talk about the origins of anaerobic threshold and why we really care. And this is the backbone of everything that we're going to talk about, everything that you care about as an athlete, I would imagine. So it's the highest intensity or speed an athlete can sustain without accumulating lactate. All right, so as we talked about before, it's the steady state between lactate production and combustion. A lot of people probably have this idea in their head that lactate is lactic acid. It's that burning feeling you have in your muscle. Hopefully, we're going to dispel some of that as we go through this. Lactate is the fuel. So if we think about the Krebs cycle, you ingest carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is converted to glucose. Glucose eventually becomes lactate. So that's the fuel that we use when we go out there and we ride, we run, we swim. So if we look at what is anaerobic threshold, what is your FTP, those two terms. So let's talk about terminology. Anaerobic threshold, FTP, lactate threshold, these are all terms that are used interchangeably typically. A lot of athletes may refer to their FTP as their 20-minute power. That can be a little bit misleading, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this in the past. If you go out and you do a 20-minute test and you try to take a certain percentage, call it 95% of that, and see what you might be able to hold for an hour, that usually is going to be an overestimate. And depending on how high that number actually is, you may way overshoot it, and now all of a sudden all of your zones are way out of whack. So just quickly, and I'll make this presentation available to all of you through Jeff, gives us a quick idea of what is anaerobic threshold and or FTP. We're not going to spend too much time on this. So the idea being threshold, anything around threshold allows us to go more or less indefinitely. The bottleneck here is we'd run out of available glucose. Anything that's shorter than that, where we're producing lactate and we can't clear it as quickly as we're producing it, we're going to go for a shorter period of time, depending on how high that intensity is, how hard we're pushing.
Which, I mean, was basically inevitable for it, but yeah, so like, maybe a little more shaky than we had been led to believe, but I mean, still just crazy. So.
Sorry, I thought that was a question here. All right, so what determines power and speed of somebody's threshold? And why does Tony Martin have, say, a threshold power of 400 watts? And let's pretend that's me on the right-hand side. I've got a power of 250 watts at threshold.
Guys. Sorry.
We okay? You guys still hear me?
Yeah, keep going.
Yep.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
All right, cool. All right, so what determines power at anaerobic threshold or FTP? So we're looking at the top here, we have anaerobic capacity or glycolysis and then aerobic capacity on the right. So it's going to be a combination of these two energy systems that come together to give us a definition of what an athlete's anaerobic threshold is. All right, so we have our aerobic and anaerobic engine. These two components are really important, and this gives us roughly 97.5% of somebody's complete physiological profile. So what I want to get to here is comparing two separate athletes and giving us some talking points to think about what is happening. So we have a body weight that's very similar between these two riders, 75 kilos. VO2 max for rider A is 50, for rider B is 63. Okay, so again, we go back to what is VO2 max? That's the size of the engine, all right? VLA max, this is probably a term that's relatively new for most of you. Hopefully the takeaway at the end of this, maybe there's 2 or 3 key takeaways. One is VLA max is probably the most important performance indicator for everyone on this phone call. The reason being, VLA max is by definition our glycolytic flux rate. Well, okay, Greg, that doesn't tell me too much. That sounds fancy. What does it really do? It's going to regulate our ability to put out power at threshold. It's also going to dictate what we're using in terms of fuel substrate. Are we more biased towards using carbohydrate, or are we more biased towards using fatty acid? For most of us that are doing longer events, anything that's 2, 3, 4, 5 hours plus, we're going to want that bias more towards fat. Okay, so we want to be more reliant on using fat. That's not to say that all of a sudden we don't have to ingest any sort of carbohydrate, but we want to be thoughtful of where are we getting that energy from. Okay, so VLA max is going to have a big determining factor here on what we're using as a fuel substrate, as well as how much of our threshold we can tap into. Now, just to give some context to numbers here, you see 0.3, you see 0.9. 0.3 seems kind of low, 0.9 seems kind of high. 0.3 is what's going to be needed to win an Ironman. 0.9 is going to be what's needed to win a sprint stage at the Tour de France. So the lower is going to be good if we're steady state, long distance, call it 3, 4, 5 hours plus. High is going to be good if we're a sprinter. We're trying to put out a lot of power in a sprint. I don't think there's too many people on this phone call right now or on the Zoom conference that are too interested in probably going out there and maximizing their sprint. I imagine most people are probably more interested in how do I get the most out of myself for a consistent effort over the course of 3 or 4 hours. And that's where we want to talk about reducing VLA max is probably the ticket in many cases. Now, really importantly, we can see that these two athletes have the same output in terms of their threshold. So big discrepancy between VO2 max and VLA max, but surprisingly, they both have the same output at threshold. Now, to take it a step further, if we were to do a 20-minute FTP test, what a lot of people think of as the standard and then extrapolate as a percentage, rider B here would probably be able to put out something like 320 watts for 20 minutes. Rider A might only be able to put out something like 265 watts. The reason being, rider B is going to be able to ride above his threshold and produce much more lactate than the rider on the left. All right, and this is going to become more evident as we go through. Some additional information on VLA max versus VO2 max. So we can see the difference between a pro and a recreational rider on the left in terms of VO2 max. We can see a pro is going to be in the mid to high 70s. Somebody that's an amateur might be closer to 60. So what's that look like in terms of a delta? 22%. Now, if we look at that in the same relationship between VLA max and VO2 max, we're going to see that the average professional is going to be closer to about 0.35. Most recreational riders are going to be 0.6, 0.7. So we're looking at about a 5-fold increase. So if we're comparing the two and we're saying where can we get more bang for our buck in terms of translating this to performance, typically looking at VLA max and manipulating that is the lower hanging fruit. And here we have some information about outputs in sprints. So you can see here, high VLA max, 0.9, we're going to be able to get about a 1700 watt peak power output. 0.5, this is going to be somebody that's a little bit more of an all-rounder, somebody that can go out there and do pretty well in a rolling stage in the tour, or somebody locally that can kind of mix it up and do some road races, do pretty well in some triathlons, that kind of thing. And then somebody that's on the low side, 0.3, we can see what that translates into total sprint power, only about 1,000 watts. But that's somebody that also is going to do much better in a long sustained effort, whether it's a 40-minute climb, 40-minute time trial, or a 4, 5, 6, 10-hour event. All right, so how do we change threshold? How do we improve it? If we're looking at rider A, this rider already has a pretty low VLA max. So this comes to what Jeff, what Sue, what your coach might be prescribing to you, what we're going to do to take action on this. So rider A, we already have a pretty low VLA max. Training, increase VO2 max. So there's a number of different interventions that we can look at. One would be we're going to do a lot of time in our kind of our base building zone, something that's going to be fairly easy. And then we're going to probably polarize that a little bit and spend some time doing some VO2 max work. So that could be 40-20s, that could be 3 minutes times 5. And again, it goes back to what is your specific lactate production and combustion rate when you're doing that. And you'll be able to see that here in a second, how we're going to be able to really hone in and see specifically what's happening when we're doing those intervals. Now for the rider on the right, if we look at adaptation, VO2 max from 50 to 60 for this rider, where all of a sudden we're going to see a increase by about 60 watts at threshold. So that's pretty big. Now this comes from the specificity of knowing, all right, where is this rider today? Where do we want to go? And knowing specifically what we want to target, which energy system we want to hone in on. Now on the other side, we have decreased VLA max. All right, so we're going to go from 0.9 to 0.5 for this athlete, and look at that. All of a sudden, we're at that same roughly 300 watt threshold power. All right, so two riders that may look the same in terms of how they present, going out there doing a field test for 20 minutes, very, very different in terms of the construction of where that power comes from. All right, so same idea, same threshold, but completely different goals for training. And this is another example here. So we talk about lactate production and combustion. This is an important piece of this. So a lot of people think, again, lactate is this lactic acid thing that we get in our legs, that's the burning sensation. It's actually the fuel that we're going to use to go out there and ride our bike in this case. We can see watts going across the bottom here, and then millimoles of lactate that we're producing per minute. I'm not going to get too bogged down in the details other than to say we have two riders that are very similar in terms of what they look like at threshold. So if we go down here to the bottom, they both have a threshold. If we look here where the X and Y axis meet, it's roughly 375 watts. Now don't get caught up in going, oh man, these riders are way out of my league. This could be 200 watts, it could be 150. The wattage doesn't matter. What's important is everything that's happening above that. So if we're concerned with specificity of what we're doing, if we're concerned with maximizing our gains, I think everyone's in a scenario where we don't have all the time in the world to go out and train. Maybe it's only 5 hours a week, maybe it's only 10 hours a week. We want to be very specific. So now what we can see is at a very specific wattage, what is happening in terms of total accumulation of lactate. All right, and these two riders, although they appear similar in terms of their FTP test, are very, very dissimilar in terms of what they actually produce lactate above threshold. So at 5 minutes, one lactate produced 13 millimoles of lactate, the others only produced 8. Now, for context, most riders, I would imagine most people that we're talking to or I'm talking to today are going to have a ceiling that's somewhere between 10 and 12 millimoles, okay? So it may not even be realistic to think that this athlete could get to 13 millimoles. So for prescribing a workout that has this athlete hypothetically getting a 13 millimoles, they're probably falling off their bike on the side of the road after 2 or 3 minutes. They can't accomplish the goal of this workout, potentially. All right, so here we have some additional information about the types of training. I'm going to send this over so you guys can take a look at it and go into more detail. But the idea being we want to specify the type of training to the type of rider that we are. We all have unique blood types. We all have unique needs in terms of what we might need to supplement, let's say, high in one area, low in another. Same thing with training. Same thing with our unique physiology. Identifying that and being able to put a bullseye on it and then periodize the training that fits along with us as unique individuals. All right, so how do we change threshold by different types of training? This is something that Jeff and Sue and your coach will work with you specifically on to talk about, all right, based on your unique physiology, here's what we want to do. Here's the best way to either increase VO2 max, increase VLA max, decrease VLA max, etc. And you can see there's some different interventions here that we have listed. You may see some of them up and down depending on what you're going to be doing. So high intensity intervals effect on VLA max. This is going to be dependent, we go back, that's going to be somewhat dependent on the time of those intervals and then the recovery in between each one. All right, so some good rules of thumb are very generically speaking, anything that's going to be hard, short, high intensity effort, that triggers our glycolytic system. So that's going to increase VLA max. So weight training, town line sprints. I know a lot of people like to do that when they're going out there doing their long group rides. If your goal is to reduce VLA max, because that's going to help boost up your threshold power, you want to avoid that. All right. And I'm guilty as charged. I enjoy going out doing those spirited rides, but you got to hold back, especially when you're a hard block and you're really trying to maximize those gains. It sounds kind of silly to say, but you're trying to reduce VLA max. You want to kind of hold back on that. You don't want to get too competitive. All right. So a lot of this you guys can go through on your own. This I brought up here just to further emphasize that not all power is created equal. All right, so if we have a 5-minute maximal effort, or 4-minute in this case maximal effort, and we see that creatine phosphate, glycolysis, and oxidation, so our aerobic metabolism, are going to be the 3 contributors to that power. We don't have to get caught up in what do these different terms mean. We don't have to get caught up in all the science behind it. All I want you to see here very clearly in this graph is look at the difference of where that power is coming from. All right, we have some slight variances here that add up to big differences, all right? Because if we're able to maximize the most of each one of these, that can be 15 watts. So just think about that when you go out and you're training. There's a reason why you have a very specific way in which you're gonna go out there day to day and perform certain intervals, certain types of rides and runs and swims in order to maximize your potential as an athlete. And this all comes from understanding what's under the hood. This is a breakdown of 3 energy systems. Hopefully illustrates a little bit more of what I was just talking about. So we have our creatine phosphate that more or less after about 30 seconds, we've bottomed that out. And we then have our anaerobic capacity, VLA max, in this kind of purple line that after about a minute, we start to see a fall off. And then our aerobic capacity, this is our long, slower, steady state effort. We're mainly contributing fat towards the energy, or energy is generally coming from fat for that type of effort. And we can see that that's generally an hour plus type of effort. All right, so just some further reinforcement here. Lactate is always the end point or end product of glycolysis. This probably goes a little bit too deep, but just want you to, again, see for reinforcement here that lactate is not evil. We don't have to worry about it. Not something to fear. Here we can look at an athlete that has a FTP, or a threshold power, of roughly about 440, 445 watts. And the interesting thing is, by knowing their unique attributes, we actually don't want them to sit for 40K or 50K TT right at threshold. We'd probably want them to go over, and if we know what their lactate ceiling is, call it 12, 13 millimoles, what we'd probably want them to do is get to the finish line at 12 or 13 millimoles. So in order to do that, there's going to be periods of that race, of that TT, where they're going slightly over. I know for most of you, you're talking about doing longer races, but I got to imagine there's a few of you who may go out there and do some TTs from time to time. This is something that I just want you to be aware of. We're not going to want to sit right at threshold the entire time. There's gains that we can have by giving it more effort on the climb, or maybe there's a technical section into the headwind where we can put out more power and gain more time back if we're thoughtful of where do we put down power and what are we absolutely capable of as an athlete. All right, so let me get out of this, and we're going to jump into what INSCYD actually is. Guys still seeing my screen okay?
All good, Greg. Thank
Jeff?
you. Yep.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to jump into INSCYD. Here is the software. So this is what Jeff and Sue have been using now for about a year and a half. We may have some people that actually did a lactate test. So there's 2 different ways that we can capture information. One is doing a lactate test. The unique thing with this is you can do this in the field. You can do it with the swim, the bike, and the run. Now, there's some limiting factors there. One, you need to have the coach with you when you do this test. And right now we obviously, with social distancing, can't be one-on-one with athletes. So what's an alternative? Well, the alternative that we recently launched is called Power Performance Decoder. And what that means is by having an athlete go out in the field, and this can be done indoors, we have a Zwift protocol, we have trainer road protocol, or outdoors, your favorite road, whatever it is. So indoor or outdoor, you follow a very specific protocol that includes 4 different intervals. What you then do is you send that fit file to Jeff. Jeff goes into INSCYD and he sees exactly what you're seeing right now. He plugs in that fit file, and magically, not really quite magically, but what he's able to do is create a report, your unique physiological profile from all that data. So again, you can be anywhere in the world. You can be indoor on your Zwift, your whatever type of trainer. If you have a Tax Neo, if you have a Wahoo, it doesn't matter. You can be outdoors. The only thing that is required is that you have a power meter. Now, with that information, INSCYD is able to complete a metabolic profile of you. Now, in terms of accuracy, the level of accuracy of this is going to be on par with using gas exchange or lactate. So what we did is we've been beta testing this with a number of teams. Team CCC, as well as a number of professional triathletes, have been using this for the last 6 months. And what we're doing, as they're actually doing the testing, we're getting gas exchange information as well as lactate, blood lactate values from them to be able to benchmark it. And we have probably at least 100 different athletes that we've been able to compare that data for, and it matches up. Like the values are out of this world. Sue and I talked about this last time we had a conversation. She's a math geek, I will say, in a very polite way, and I think she even had some positive feedback for us. And my business partner, Sebastian Weber, he doesn't get out of bed in the morning without a good excuse, scientifically speaking. So everything is benchmarked and validated against peer-reviewed studies that are out there. That's the other thing with INSCYD. Everything is peer-reviewed. Everything is available as open source. So there's nothing here that's based on just a power duration curve. It's all based on published peer-reviewed literature. All right. So great, Greg, tell me the details. So let me jump into this. I'm going to go to manage tests. I'm going to pull up a test here of an athlete. This is assuming that your coach already took your information and ran it, and I want you to have a better understanding of what this data represents and why it might be beneficial. So what we have here is an athlete. This was a cycling test. I'm the hypothetical coach. So this is a friend of mine, actually, in real life, Mike, and Mike lives in Utah. He races mountain bikes. He also does some cyclocross racing in the fall. So what we have here, and by the way, I asked him if it was okay if I shared his data, so we don't have any violations here. VO2 max, talked a little bit about this. This is our aerobic capacity. We have a relative and total number here. Most people refer to it as the relative number. So this is 55 milliliters per minute per kilogram, and then total just over 4 liters. VLA max. So what we can see here is we have a graph that's going to represent high and low. So VO2 max, higher is generally always better. VLA max, that's not the case. Lower in many cases is better. So for us as triathletes, lower is probably going to be better, okay? Higher is going to be good if we want to be a really good sprinter, if we're interested in racing primarily criteriums, maybe if we're only doing cyclocross racing and we don't have a lot of time to train. Threshold we see as a relative, watts per kilo, and then total. And then the other thing that we can see here is percentage of VO2 max. So as our efficiency in terms of our glycolytic capacity increases, and what I mean by that is we reduce our VLA max, we're going to see that we're able to tap into a greater percentage of our VO2 max here at threshold. And that's really the goal. How close to VO2 max can we get at threshold? You may have seen Kipchoge, he broke the 2-hour marathon record or went sub 2 hours in that unofficial Ineos marathon. He was able to do that because his power, his speed at threshold is so close to VO2 max. It's probably about 84, 85%. So that's a pretty amazing number if you contrast that with other athletes. And we have a lot of data that we could go through, and I'm happy to answer questions about that later on. Fat max, this is where we're getting max combustion of fatty acid. So this does not mean that we're exclusively using fat at this pace, but what it means is this is where we're getting peak amount of fat contributing to us pedaling, in this case at 164 watts is where that occurs. And we can see total kilocalories as well. And then carb max, this is the last metric that we get to. This is just our unique way of saying if you're going to go out there and do a really long effort, something that's 10 plus hours, this is the pace that you're able to sustain more or less indefinitely if you're taking in 90 grams of exogenous carbohydrate per hour. Now, this raises an important question. What is that limit? What is that number? We know based on the literature right now, 60 to 90 grams is the max amount of exogenous carb you can get in per hour. So that's probably about 2 Cliff Bars, maybe 4 or 5 gels. You may want to think about how much you're getting in whatever drink you're taking in. So if it's Osmo, if it's Scratch, whatever it is, be aware of that and be thoughtful when you're going out and you're going out for your next longer ride, race, etc. All right, so we've gone through this as a high-level overview. So now what do we do with this? Now we start to construct a training plan based on the goals. So let's say for Mike, I know one of his goals later on this summer is to do a 6-7 hour mountain bike race, 6 to 7 hours. It's called the Point to Point out in Park City, Utah. So for him, we need to focus on how do we get him ready to go at a sustained probably 220 watts, 230 watts for 4, 5, 6 hours of total pedaling. Keep in mind it's a mountain bike race, so it's 7 hours total, but it's probably a total of 5.5 hours of actual pedaling time. So if we want to maximize his potential, knowing that it's a long, sustained effort, there's not going to be a lot of changes in pace. He's going to be out there grinding alone. We want to probably focus on reducing his anaerobic capacity, reducing his VLA max. So that's the dial that we want to start to tweak. Some other alternatives might be, hey, do we increase his VO2 max to get a higher capacity or a bigger engine? I'm probably a little bit more interested in saying, all right, Mike doesn't have a whole lot of time. He's time crunched. He doesn't get the best sleep because he's got young kids. So what's going to be a little less intense in terms of his training load and still allow him to live his life? It's not going to beat him down as much. So it's the right kind of compromise. And that probably means more in the way of reducing his VLA max. Now, what we're seeing here is his unique attributes right now as an athlete and how we apply this to that training plan that we're going to talk about. So the first thing is metabolic demand and VO2. So metabolic demand is linear, okay? And that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to anyone watching right now, but the idea is that when we're riding a bike, it's not a free motion activity. If this was running or swimming, we'd see a line that was unique to you as an athlete because we'd have run and swim economy that was accounted for. But we're on a bike, so gross efficiency riding a bike is going to be the same across the board for all of us. So what we can see is everything here in white is our aerobic metabolism contributing to that power. Everything here in the lighter blue is anaerobic contribution. So what I can do down below is I can see at any given wattage, where is that energy coming from? Okay. Now, why does this matter? Well, we may get shelled anytime there's a 2, 3, 4 minute climb. We may get shelled anytime there's a 1 minute surge in a race. We may get dropped when there's a 10-minute climb. Now we can start understanding what energy systems are coming into play at that particular wattage, and how do we put together a plan to help increase your efficiency there or take care of or address that issue, that shortcoming. Now to take that a step further, if we go over here to the right, lack of pyruvate and lactate accumulation, again, what we're looking at here is the bottom of this V is threshold, okay? So by definition, threshold, whether it's lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold, or FTP, means the steady state between producing. So we can see to the right, we're producing or accumulating lactate. Everything to the left is combusting it. We're getting rid of it, okay? So that V is representative, the bottom of that V is representative of where we're in this homeostasis or steady state between producing and combusting lactate. So now I'm your coach, I'm Mike's coach here, and I send him out to do intervals at 310 watts. I can see in this highlighted area what exactly is happening. So at 310 watts, Mike is producing 1.35 or just over. At 312 watts, Mike's accumulating 1.35 millimoles of lactate per minute. Now, again, let's put this in context. Why does this matter? Well, scientifically, we know that for every millimole of lactate we produce or accumulate above threshold, we need to do something with it. And we can only go so far above it until our body says, no, we can't continue to go this hard. We get to our ceiling. So if we're trying to stimulate a certain type of system, in this case, we were trying to do VO2 max intervals, we want to know what is the ideal rate of work and what is the ideal rate of rest, and what is the time equation there. So we can look at the literature and say the literature tells us the total time spent in terms of VO2 stimulus needs to be at least 12 to 15 minutes as an example for the total workout. And because of oxygen kinetics, so the time it takes our heart rate to get us to peak VO2 max might be 30, 60, 90 seconds. So we can't say if we're doing 5 by 3 minutes, we're at 15 minutes total. Maybe we're losing a couple minutes at the beginning because of those kinetics. So I know we're going into the weeds a little bit, but the idea is this is a complex equation that if we have this information, we can now start to solve the equation and say, all right, what Mike is doing is accumulating 1.35 millimoles per minute. He's going to go out there and let's say it's for a 5-minute interval. So we have him doing 5 by 5 minutes in this scenario. So for each minute, he's again at 1.35. I multiply that by 5. So to make it simple, let's say it's 6.5 millimoles that he accumulates in that 5 minutes, okay? So instead of saying 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, we don't know that. We know that the literature, the science tells us we need 75% of maximum recovery in order to maximize this adaptation that I'm going for. So if that's the case, I go over here and I look at recovery rates and I see that recovery, not all recovery is created equal. Look at this. If I'm pedaling along at 165 watts, I look down below, I'm combusting 0.5 millimole per minute. If I'm just going really easy at something like 95 watts, I'm only at 0.33. Conversely, if I'm going pretty hard and I'm at 233, I'm still combusting, not that much, but 0.2 millimoles. So there's a curve here, okay? And now we can see what's happening. So for Mike, it's not going to be as simple as saying 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off. So this is the reason why you may get a workout that says 5 minutes on, 10 minutes off. Or instead of doing 5 minutes on, we're going to do 40 seconds on, 20 seconds off. And we do that for 5 minutes. And then we do only 5 minutes of recovery. So we can maximize what we're trying to get out of it in terms of looking at the big picture. What are we looking at for the goals of this cycle, this next 2 to 3 months? And then how do we break that up into chunks, and how do we periodize that to build you up over that time and give you some breaks in between? Maybe every 2 to 3 weeks you have a rest week, allow you to recover a little bit, and then after 2 or 3 months we test. So we come back and we do another test and see, all right, hopefully what we were doing worked. Now the idea behind INSCYD is it's giving you the insights as to where you start and what's going to be the outcome. I'm going to show you that in a second. Now, if we look at fat and carb combustion down below, this is going to give us some indication as to what we need to do in terms of training and racing as it relates to our nutrition. What is our strategy? So for Mike here, he's doing his 7-hour mountain bike race. And again, his threshold is 250 watts. His goal is probably 220 watts or so for that race. So if I go down below and zoom this in here, I go down below to 220 watts and I see that Mike is combusting 139 grams, call it 140 grams of carbohydrate per hour. All right. I think a lot of us are probably going to say, man, I don't have a fueling issue, but I bonk quite a bit. Well, I would say that that fundamentally, by definition, is a fueling issue. Or maybe we just don't feel great in the back half of our rides or our races. An Ironman, maybe the run is never good for us. Let's start thinking about it in a different way. Is it a fitness issue or is it a fueling issue? All right, what we've seen is primarily it's a fueling issue. It's not so much a fitness issue. So what we can see here for Mike is 140 grams per hour. We multiply that by 7, okay? So 140 times 7, that gives us, let's just use round numbers and make it really easy. That gives us a total combustion for that race of 1,000 grams of carbohydrate. But we know, based on his unique attributes as an athlete, and INSCYD calculates our body composition. That's something that we didn't go too much detail into, but we know how much muscle you have and how much muscle glycogen you can store up. So now, knowing how much muscle glycogen we have, what we're able to do is back that out. So let's make it really easy on ourselves. Let's say 300 grams of muscle glycogen, 1,000 total grams of carbohydrate expenditure. We back that out. So that's 700 grams of carbohydrate that we need to take in exogenously over that 7-hour race. So that's 100 grams per hour. Number one, mountain bike race, that's going to be really tough. Number two, 90 grams is the ceiling. So what do? Maybe we recalibrate. Maybe we say, all right, we got to reduce this by 20 grams an hour. So we got to, instead of going at 220, we got to drop it down to something like 200 just to be safe. Or we can look at what are some of those ways in which we can manipulate Mike as an athlete. Remember, we talked about reducing VLA max. As we reduce VLA max, we increase our reliance on fat. So in Mike's case, what I'm going to do is show you guys how we're able to go back and create a virtual carbon copy of Mike. But what we can do is look at any of the variables. We can change body fat, we can change VO2 max, we can change VLA max. So this allows us to look into the future. So for a lot of us, we may be thinking about, all right, we know where we are today, but in this hypothetical world, if our training goes as planned, what can we do to maximize our potential? So for Mike, it's not unrealistic to think that, all right, we can reduce VLA max to 0.35. So if we do that, and we take a look at Mike in future state version after probably 3-4 months of training for this specific type of adaptation, and by the way, that adaptation would occur if we're doing something that's high torque, low cadence. So that's going to be recruiting our fast twitch muscle fibers more efficiently than going out and doing a 5-6 hour ride. What we're able to do under high torque, low cadence conditions is within, let's say, 3 by 10 minute at threshold intervals, we get that kind of motor recruitment or muscular recruitment. So we're able to do it in a very condensed period of time. That's one way to do it. 2 would be more time spent in our fat max zone. 3 might be some fasted training. And that's not fasted training going out there and really kicking ourselves hard. What we want to do is go out there and maybe do an hour, 1 or 2 days a week. And that's just to signal the body a little bit to say, hey, look, we want to adapt and start becoming a little bit more reliant on using fat as a fuel source. Now, don't conflate fat as a fuel source with ketogenic and any of the other diets that are out there. 2 separate things. This is just getting our body more efficient at using fatty acid as a fuel source. All right, so now we go to threshold. Boom, 273 is our new threshold. And we can see our fat max jump from, I think it was 163 to 184. All right, now no change to our VO2 max, VLA max dropped, threshold went up by, I want to say this is 23 watts. Now what's really cool is we can now go back and map these 2 on top of one another. So I want to see before and after for Mike. And what I can see is by comparing the 2 of these, where Mike was and where he went. So we'll start with fat and carb combustion. We talked about 220 watts. So I'll zoom in and we can see at this 220 watt, and I went a little bit too far. Let me reset that. So at 220 watts previously, Mike was at 140 grams of carbohydrate. Now I can see down below, Mike is at 107 grams. So we're comfortably below that threshold that we had talked about. So we've saved ourselves a lot of time. We haven't had to reduce our wattage. In fact, maybe we could go up. Maybe we could go to something like 225 watts. And we're still at only 113 grams of carbohydrate. So hopefully you can see here how you and your coach can start to play with these different scenarios. Number one is understanding where you are today. Number two is starting to think about the total time that I have to train. And then what are the interventions that make the most sense for me as an athlete? And then from there, we can look at, all right, what are some of the outcomes that we could start to expect, and how does that impact my performance and my goal setting? And how does that change my mindset as to what I'm going to go out and do every day? It's easy for us to probably get caught up in maybe there's not a race on the horizon right now. We're under some really tough conditions. I don't want to minimize that, but hopefully this gives us some motivation to keep training, number one. Number two, hopefully this is a new way that we can start looking at our performance and what brings it together, what by definition our performance is made of. All right, so the other elements of INSCYD, I want to quickly show you this. I apologize if I'm getting long-winded here. I thank you guys for sticking with me here. Just going to go back to this athlete Mike here and look at one other thing that's important to note. This is the body composition, two things I should say. So body composition just gives us an understanding of what's happening in terms of body compartment, water space, active muscle space. This is what we use to calculate total muscle glycogen, and then water space and passive lactate space. Lactate space is important because that allows us to dilute lactate when we produce it. So body fat, body composition is something that is important for all athletes. As somebody that's had an eating disorder, I'm sensitive to that discussion, and I think it's something that you and your coach should enter into under the understanding that that's a difficult discussion, that's a difficult issue for any athlete to go through. So I'm very sensitive to that, and if anyone wants to talk about it in more detail one-on-one or with your coach, I have some resources I'd be happy to share with Jeff and Sue. Certainly reach out. Now, if we go to training zones, this is where things get a little bit unique, is we're not basing this on a number, on a percentage. So we're not saying, all right, Mike had a 250 watt threshold and now all of a sudden we base everything off of that. No, we're looking at what is Mike's anaerobic capacity, what is his VO2 max as measured in this test that we know is going to be the same as him in terms of validation, in terms of accuracy, going into a lab using gas exchange. So the big mass you've probably seen, we're able to get that same thing without all that stuff, without all that gear, in the comfort of your own home or the comfort of the roads that you know on the bike that you're training and racing on. So it's even better because you don't have to fudge any of the information now and say, well, I was on this erg bike in the lab, now what about the power and all that? It's right here in front of you. And your coach may decide that they want to customize this. So for some of us, maybe we're doing more of a 2 or 3 zone system. Maybe it's all these zones are applicable, but all this is customizable. So we could change this to tempo zone 1 or something like that. I don't know why you call it that, but it just bounced in my mind. All this is customizable. And then for you as the athlete, what's cool is we can actually go over here and see, all right, Jeff, he's my coach. All of a sudden, he told me, Greg, go out and do a 4-hour medio ride. So I look here, 4-hour medio ride. I go across. Oh, boy, that's going to be a tough one. I'm going to be combusting 118 grams carb per hour. He told me that tomorrow I got to back this up with something really hard. I'm going to be doing some VO2 max work. So that means that I need to be very mindful of total carb combustion and taking in food during the course of that ride. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to get home in 18 hours I have to refeed and replenish, be able to get that all in. It doesn't matter how much pasta and pizza and whatever else I eat. It doesn't matter. I've already drained it to the point where you can't replenish it in that period of time. It really takes us about 72 hours to fully maximize glycogen stores. So that's an overview. I hope that gives you guys a better understanding of how INSCYD works. Main takeaways are do it at home, follow a very specific protocol that Jeff has. What you're able to get is a very complete and very accurate global view of you physiologically as an athlete. And what you can then do with it, what your coach can do with it, is create a very customized training plan regardless of the time that you have to hopefully go out there and improve your performance. And I think a lot of you will be surprised at how much room there is to go. Even if you say, look, I've been working with a coach for 5 years or 10 years, I've always had an FTP of 200, 300, it doesn't matter. This gives you new eyes on it. It gives you a new way to look at it and figure out, where's my performance coming from? Where is it constructed? What do I want to focus on? What are these dials or levers that I can start playing with, or my coach can start playing with, to help hopefully increase that performance the next time you go out there and race, or you get into a Zwift race, or you just want to show your friends when you go out there who's the boss. One last thing, and I'll shut up and answer questions. INSCYD has a unique engine in terms of how it calculates male versus female. So not only are there differences in terms of our not genetics, but in terms of our presentation, but internally we have very different lactate distribution space, adipose tissue, etc. So based on the literature, we have a different calculation for how we calculate a female versus a male. So that's something that I wanted to note as well. All right, so with that, I appreciate you guys and would love to answer any questions. And I'm trying to pull up here to see if I can find the chat to find any questions.
Well, Greg, I'll jump in before you get to that. We do have a question from Kathy, but before we get to that, this is the entire reason that I wanted to have you on the call tonight, was that with all of our races canceled, at least through the first half of the year, it seems, that this is a unique opportunity for us to break things down and take a look inside and figure out what we need to work on, so that if we're planning a race for the second half of the year, or even if we're just pushing things off to next year, at least we have a focus and we have the time to change things, rather than doing this test 4 weeks or 6 weeks out from a race where there isn't enough time to really anything. Like, this is our opportunity to really make a difference here.
Definitely. Yeah, I can answer that in a few different ways. One is, how long does it take for an adaptation to occur? If we look at the half-life of cell mitochondria, we know that that's about 28 days. So that means that anything we do now is not going to be reflected in our performance for a minimum of probably 6 to 8 weeks. So what we're doing today is not going to be seen in our performance for at least a couple months. Now, if we start looking at the bigger picture, if we have an athlete, Mike is a good example here, VLA max is kind of high, VO2 max could probably be optimized as well in terms of what is that potential. And we know, this is an important piece, we know that there is no ceiling to our VO2 max. There's no genetic predisposition that says, all right, Sharon, you, and Ira, you, and Michael, you have, and those are the 3 windows that are up right now that I'm looking at, you have a ceiling of this because your parents did this and didn't do that. We don't know that. We know that on average, most athletes can see about a 25 to 30% jump in VO2 max. Some may be more, some may be a little bit less, but there's nothing that says, hey, you're limited. So for somebody like Mike, he hasn't been training that long, probably hasn't focused that much on optimizing what he's doing in terms of his performance. Number one, we got plenty of time to work on increasing his aerobic capacity, otherwise known as VO2 max. The other thing we can do is reduce VLA max, and that may take some time. It's not like these things are instant on, instant off. If it was that easy, all of us could hop off the couch and go out and run a really good marathon with 2 months of training, and we know it's not that easy. So depending on what these goals are, depending on how specific we want to get, at least 3-4 months is probably, I would say, the minimum to start to see some pretty impactful changes, and maybe it's even more than that. That's why you see over the course of many seasons, athletes get better and better at the highest level. You don't come in year one as a professional and get your best placing in the Tour de France or an Ironman, and even as an amateur. generally speaking, your best performances take many years to come.
And so Kathy had asked, we've talked a lot tonight about the bike and how bike performance and power on the bike matters, but how does VO2 max translate between the bike and run, and how do we increase / contribute to improvement in both?
Yeah, great question. I'll answer that in terms of swim and run, because I think a lot of us here are triathletes, so at a certain point in time, we're going to be able to get back in the pool and swim as well. So swim and run are free motion sports, meaning we're not in a fixed plane. Run and swim economy are going to be a little bit different depending on an athlete. Now, if we take a population and we say, generically speaking, based on the literature, sorry if I sound like a broken record, but I want to make sure that we're steeping this in what does the science tell us. So we're going to be able to say that most athletes are going to have slightly higher VO2 max when they're running and potentially when they're swimming, because it is free motion sport and you're incorporating a little bit more of the complete body into it. More tissue, higher the VO2 max, higher the number. Now, we're not talking about 20%. We're talking about maybe 4, 5, 6% on the high end. So what we're able to do is take the data and say that if you have a certain type of characteristic, meaning you're more dependent on carbohydrate or you're more dependent on fat, so your VLA max is kind of high, your VLA max is on the lower side of things, we know that that's going to translate to the other disciplines. So testing on the bike only will yield good results, because what we can then do is apply those same principles to what we're doing on the run and the swim.
Great.
And I will add that what we can also do, if we have athletes out there that are using heart rate, what you can do is test using heart rate. And now we know, based on your heart rate, what zone you're in for each level. So if your recovery heart rate is, let's say, 110, your threshold heart rate on the bike is something like 160, 170. Now we can use that as a proxy for the other disciplines. And there's ways I'll talk to your coaches about how we would apply that, but that's very easy to do if you're using heart rate as well. Now, heart rate from a awareness standpoint, or the way that heart rate kinematics work, is it's going to take some time for heart rate to catch up to the effort. So if we're doing short, let's say under 1.5 minutes, 2 minute efforts for any type of application, swim, bike, or run, we want to be mindful that heart rate isn't always going to be the best proxy to measure what's actually happening.
And then Greg, obviously body composition here matters, but what if folks don't have either access to calipers or body composition scale, and like, how do we get this data accurate, or how much does it matter?
Yeah. So we're talking, number one, let's think about where we're trying to go here. Are we trying to win the Tour de France? And that's no offense to anyone that's joined us here. Do we need the smallest marginal gains? So does a body fat of 10 to 9% make a difference in our overall composition of what we're looking at? Even at the highest level, I'd argue no. I think certainly for most of us, there's so many other gains that we can have, and that's just getting a good night's sleep. That's just optimizing nutrition, things like that. So to answer your question really specifically, Jeff, if you don't have access to either a bioimpedance scale and you can use that on a consistent basis just to see where the trends are, that's what we're looking for. So we want to know generically, are you more like a 10% kind of athlete? Are you 15? Are you 20? Are you 25%? And the reason why that's important is, as we talked about before, lactate distribution space, that area that we have to dissolve lactate when we go out there and we do a hard effort, that is going to be implicated in our total body fat. So we just want to know what the body fat percentage is roughly. It doesn't need to be an exact number. And keep in mind, there's going to be variance between skin fold calipers, a bod pod, a DEXA scan. you're going to see probably a 5-6 percentage point difference for the same athlete between those. So there's no one way to say, yep, boom, got it. This is absolutely it. So that's how we'd want to look at it. If you have bioimpedance scale at your house, great. If you don't, you have a rough idea, use that. There's also some calculations based on your neck diameter, diameter of your neck, circumference of your neck, not diameter. That'd be kind of weird. Circumference of your waist, and then circumference of your wrist, I believe, and then you put in the gender. And that gets you pretty close. So that would be more than appropriate to use.
All right. Well, does anyone else have any other questions for Greg before we let him go to his next presentation?
Yeah, this is Brett, longtime listener, first-time caller. Greg, I appreciate this information. One of the questions I had was just to confirm, you're saying that all this information is gathered pretty much just from a power test we can do at home?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And the power, I'll explain that in more detail. It's 4 intervals. It's going to be a short sprint, 20-second sprint, a 3-minute, a 6-minute, and a 10 to 12-minute interval.
And so then,
Thank you.
Greg, as we go through those intervals, like I've done this test myself, and running through it, we've got that 12-minute interval. So in the Zwift protocol, it gives you put in what you think your FTP is, and it spits out some targets for you to hold. And then what if you can only hold them for, say, 9.5 minutes? Or what if you get to that 12-minute mark and you're like, I'm not completely exhausted now? What do you do there?
Yeah, good question. So the software has some intelligence built into it. So we talked before about 97.5% of an athlete's complete profile. So everything that we just saw here is based on 2 things: our anaerobic capacity. So by definition, that's what we can do for short, high intensity effort. We're talking 20 seconds, and then what we can do for roughly 4 minutes. Those 2 things right there anchor 97.5% of everything we're talking about. Now, we have 4 different intervals that we have you go out there and perform. Why? Number 1, it helps safeguard against rider malfunction, athlete malfunction. Okay. Number 2, it gives us additional data to be able to use to calculate. And the way the software works is we anchor to 2 of these numbers and then run the other independent variables, and we keep bouncing back and forth, running over 40,000 calculations to circle in on or to hone in on the right number and what is the most accurate way to complete this profile of the athlete. So what we're doing is having some additional data that we can then point to say, yep, this looks good, or yeah, in the case that Jeff, you just mentioned, they probably didn't go as hard as they could have. That's okay. There's some redundancies built in to ensure that we still get really accurate information. And you can break the test up over the course of 2 or 3 days as well. So if you wanted to do let's say the sprint, the 20-second and the 3-minute on day 1, and then 6-minute on day 2, and then the 12-minute on day 3, that's fine. Or if you want to do 2 and 2, that's easy enough. And your coach can work that out in terms of how you go out there and perform the test. Now, keep in mind, it may seem, hey, this is really simple. You're going out there and doing a field test. Yes, that's the beauty of this. Think about what we're doing right now. We're on the Zoom conference. The technology allows us to virtually meet anywhere and have pretty good technology, pretty good visuals, pretty good voice to be able to do this. We're at the same point now with being able to get a complete physiological profile from an athlete capturing power only. In fact, with greater fidelity than you would get going into a lab with more metrics. If you were to go into a lab, you're only going to get VO2 max. You may get something around fat and carb combustion, but that's going to be it. You wouldn't have all the other data that we talked about. So it's unique in that you're able to get more information, believe it or not, than you would typically from a lab, and with greater accuracy.
Awesome. Well, I thank you, Greg. If anyone or if no one has any more questions, we'll let you go. Anyone?
Oh, it's good. Good. Thanks.
Thank you,
All
Enda.
right, guys. Thank you. Hopefully that was somewhat enlightening for you and not a complete waste of your Wednesday evening. So I appreciate you guys jumping on and listening to that. Thank you again.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Greg.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Greg.
All right. Take care,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye now.